Welcome back. Our upcoming presentation now is given by Paul Shillcock, author of ISO 19650-2 and the UK National Annex, and also Managing Director of Operam. Paul will present on the latest ISO 19650 and discuss how to leverage information management standards. So Paul, over to you.
Thanks, Rob. Good afternoon, everybody. So to start with, what I really wanted to do was to just set a bit of context for this presentation, starting with the production of information and some of the challenges that we face within our industry. You know, we are one of the oldest industries. We've been producing information for centuries. When you take a step back, what you actually see is a lot of individuals, teams and companies just doing their own thing, not really concerned about what anyone else is doing. Most of the time, this is this is how we've always done it approach. And why expect anything different? You know, this is how we're taught to behave. You know, engineers over here, architects over there, and so on. So we call this working in silos. And you know, over the decades, what we've seen is a rapid rise in the use of technology to be able to produce information much quicker than we've ever done before. You know, yet as an industry, we are still one of the least productive and profitable. We've got the lowest predictability around cost and time, and as a client, you're still only likely, you've got a 50-50 chance of getting your asset delivered on time and on budget. And that's even less chance if you're trying to deliver a large, complex infrastructure asset. So the question is, why hasn't all this technology helped? Okay, whilst the tools have changed, you know, the way in which we've managed information hasn't. And in my view, all the technologies enable us to do is to produce poor quality information faster than we could with the previous tool. All right, and the problem is that we're still working in these silos. And the only way that we can really move forward is that if we start to look at how we can break down a lot of those silos. All right, so the challenge to the industry is not simply just to embrace these new technologies, but to try and work together as a team, continuously coordinating the information throughout the production process. And this is what we mean by the collaborative production of information, you know, otherwise known as BIM, or building information modeling. And the reason why this is a challenge is because it requires a lot of leadership, and also requires a lot of upfront effort from all parties involved in the production of information. So to adopt a collaborative approach to the production of information, there's certain things that need to be in place. Okay, every member of the team must know precisely what information needs to be produced, who needs to produce that information, when that information needs to be produced, and how that information needs to be produced. All right, now I know this looks like common sense, all right, and unfortunately, you know, it is, but unfortunately, it's just not that common. All right, so I'd like to just think to yourself, how many projects have you worked on where you can say hand on heart that everybody in the team knows the answer to these 4 questions? All right, I'm guessing not too many. So how can we establish a consistent approach to achieving this on every single appointment and project that we deliver? And this is where standards can play a big part. All right, now I know your mics are all muted, but I can hear the size now. Standards. All right, yes, they're not the most interesting of things, but they are important. You know, imagine a world where we're driving and we didn't have things like the highway code, you know, the rules of the road, right? The standards that set out how we work together, or how we're able to share and coordinate ourselves on the road network. Okay, all it takes is one person to think, oh, I've got a better way, and it puts everybody else at risk. All right, it's the same with information management. But this is a global problem, all right, and therefore what was needed is a global approach. All right, when it comes to global approach and international standards, there's only really one player in town, and that's ISO, the International Organization for Standardization. So back in June 2014, there was a steering committee called ISO TC 59 SC 13, which is set up to look after the organization and digitalization of information about buildings and civil engineering works, including building information modeling. And the group, the steering committee, was made up from representatives from all around the world. All right, the secretariat was in Norway, There were 31 participating members, so these were countries that wanted to be actively involved in the development of the standards, and 14 observer members. So these were countries that just wanted to be involved in the voting process. Not too many from the Middle East, but certainly a broad representation from a lot of countries around the world. And the output of the committee was the ISO 19650 series, which you may have come across. Currently, there are 5 parts, all right, 4 of which have already been published, and 1 is still currently in development. So just to run you through the 5 very quickly. Part 1, starting to look at the concepts and principles behind the management of information throughout the asset lifecycle. Okay, so it's the first time that we've seen a standard look at the entire life cycle of an asset through its delivery into its operation. So very much around the concepts and principles about how information is managed. Part 2 starts to go into a little bit deeper. Now we're starting to focus specifically on the delivery phase of assets and the information management process, or the project information management process that needs to be enacted throughout that delivery phase. And we'll take a closer look at that shortly. Both parts 1 and 2 were published in December 2018. In August this year, so a couple of months ago, part 3 was finally published. All right, and now we're starting to move on to the operational phase of assets and the information management process through the operational phase. For me, part 3 is very much the prequel to part 2. So if any of you out there are asset owners, then your starting point really is part 3, looking at that operational phase and the need for information throughout the asset life cycle. Part 4, so this is the one that's currently still in development. This is starting to look at the effective exchange of information between different parties, okay, and the obligations and the roles that different parties have in terms of communicating the need for information and validating and verifying that that need is being met. Got no dates yet in terms of when that will be published. I suspect it would maybe be the end of 2021, maybe encroaching into 2022. And part 5, the last one in the series as it stands at the minute, this was published in June this year. This is starting to look at what we call adopting a security-minded approach to the management of information. Okay, this is specifically around the security of information relating to all or part of an asset that is deemed to be sensitive by the asset owner. So there we have it. They are the 5 parts of information management. So you may come across this term BIM according to ISO 19650. If you do that, this is the series that refers to. Okay, but most importantly, it defines the information management process throughout the entire life of the asset. But just focusing in on terms of the delivery phase at the moment, just to give you an idea in terms of what that process looks like. Okay, so the information management process is like any other process that you come across. Okay, it's a series of interrelated activities that converts inputs into outputs to achieve an intended result. Okay, in this case, the intended result is a complete set of information that provides an accurate representation of what's being constructed, i.e., the project information model. During the delivery phase, there are 8 steps within the process. Each step contains a number of activities which need to be completed before you move on to the next step. There are a total of 40 activities, all right, 3/4 of which need to be undertaken before you actually put pen to paper. All right, so there's a lot of upstream activities, a lot of planning activities that need to be undertaken before you actually start producing information. All right, and it's these upstream activities that enable teams to adopt that collaborative approach to the production of information and a lot of the enabling technologies that support it. So in terms of each of steps, step 1 is to be completed before any invitations tendered or even considered. All right, so these are project level activities, key decision points, and understanding and determining what information is needed at each stage of the project. Steps 2 and 3 are undertaken during the procurement stage. So this includes things like the invitation tender, the tender response, and this is really where there's the greatest opportunity to influence the outcome, okay, because everything is decided and agreed before that appointment or contract gets put in place. Steps 4 and 5 are undertaken during the information planning stage. Right, this is where the contracts are finalised and the detailed planning for the production of information and the delivery of that information is undertaken. 6 and 7 is where we actually finally get into the production of information. All right, and this is where the delivery team start to work collaboratively to produce the information that is required as part of their production, their appointment. So most of these are one-time activities. However, in terms of the production, these activities are repeated until all the information has been accepted by the client. And step 8 is undertaken once the project has been delivered. So what a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate is that the activities from 2 to 7 are actually undertaken for each and every appointment on the project. So this is not a one-time pass for each project. All right, so this is steps 2 and 7 are undertaken for each and every project. And this is why when people try and align the information management process to the project delivery process, there's not that alignment, because this is a cycle. So depending on how many appointments you have on the project, depends how many times you go through this process. All right, until all the appointments are completed, and then you go into step 8, which is the project closeout. Okay, so we've got our activities established, but who's going to undertake them? So this is where we start to look at in terms of the different parties and the teams that are involved. So if you've seen ISO 19650 Part 2, you may be familiar with this diagram, which sets out not only the parties and teams involved, but also their relationship. What you can see from the diagram is that there is one appointing party. Okay, this is the party that initiates and finances the project, typically the client or the owner, and it ultimately is the receiver of the project information model. We then have a number of appointed parties. All right, and these are the parties that are appointed to produce the information at the various stages of the projects, typically the suppliers, and ultimately tend to be the providers of the information throughout the project. However, one of those appointed parties, all right, will have a direct appointment with the client or the appointing party. All right, and these are known as the lead appointed party, and in turn they then appoint all the other appointed parties. Okay, so the lead appointed party is the appointed party that has a direct appointment with the appointing party. Pretty simple. Okay, so they're the different parties. In terms of the teams, the way this works from a team perspective is that the appointed parties tend to be individual task teams. So this is a team tasked with producing a specific set of information. The lead appointed party and their appointed parties are known collectively as the delivery team. And finally, the client or owner or the appointing party and all of the delivery teams are collectively known as the project team. So the reason behind all this is to enable us to determine who is responsible. From a drafting point of view, it enables us to set out who is responsible for each of the activities, and also in terms of when you're looking in terms of the appointments and the contracts, it's then easier to set obligations because those parties need to be defined within that appointment. So how does this work in part 2? So each of the 40 activities has their own clause. So each clause represents an activity. So in this case, we're looking at establishing the project's information production method and procedures. This activity is the responsibility of the appointing party. So we can see that because it says the appointing party shall establish blah, blah, blah. So most of the activities have this structure. So somebody shall do something. All right, and we use the modal verb shall because it is a specification. There's a bit of concern around how this goes in terms of the scalability. So most of the clauses will have a subclause. Then you're deemed to have complied with the particular clause. So how does all this help us meet the industry challenge? All right, so the key to meeting that challenge is the output of those activities, all right, many of which are used as the inputs for the next activity. So when we talk around the what, the when, the who, and the how, okay, we've got things like in terms of what information needs to be produced. We've got a range of different information requirements. We've got organizational, asset, and project information requirements. Ultimately, these are distilled into a schedule of exchange information requirements. Okay, these are not just listed deliverables, all right, that the receiver must communicate why that information is needed. All right, what questions the information will answer in order, and what decisions will those answers provide to make an informed decision. All right, for each requirement, there should be clearly identified level of information need, which includes things like the acceptance criteria, any supporting information that's needed or the provider might need in order to produce that information, and the date at which that information needs to be exchanged. As for who produces the information, we've got things in there, activities or outputs from the process, and things like the high-level responsibility matrix, detailed responsibility matrix, all of which is informed by the federation strategy. In terms of when we combine the what and the who, you can then start to look at the what at the when, okay, and understand the balance between all three of those. All right, so for that, we've got the series of information delivery plans. We've got our master information delivery plan and our task information delivery plans. All right, all of those can be baseline, so the impact of those changes can be managed. All right, and projects that don't have an effective delivery plan will tend to suffer beyond that, because no one really understands what information needs to be produced, and that change control can't be put in place. Okay, and then finally, in terms of the how, so we have a lot of outputs in the process, but in terms of how the team need to produce information, we've got the project's information standard, which looks at the structure of information, things like language, units, coordinates, attributes, style libraries, object libraries. Ideally, a lot of those standards would be based on open data standards, such as industry foundation classes, or bespoke standards, depending on who the client or the asset owner is. The team also needs to work out for each activity what the most effective production methods and procedures are going to be in terms of those tools. And this is where teams can really start to innovate and share best practice. All right. But depending on the capability and capacity of the team, depends on what that most effective method is going to be. You know, there's no point going for a full virtual reality 5D model if the quantity surveyor is still using a scale rule. All right. The procedure for each of those methods need to be documented so that everybody understands what they need to do, when they need to do it, and how they need to do it. And often that is done within what we call the BIM execution plan. But this is predominantly within the standards around what we call the information production methods and procedures. Okay, and finally, the team also need somewhere to be able to store the information that they're producing whilst they're producing. And this is why we need a shared repository, known lovingly as what we refer to as the common data environment. All right, so the CDE, as it's known, provides the enabling technologies that are there to support the collaborative production of information. All right, now in terms of when you're there, the common environment needs to be done at the project level. All right, so this is actually the responsibility of the client to provide the common data environment for that project, or indeed to employ somebody to provide it for them. Okay, so that was a very brief run through in terms of what are the 5 parts of the ISO 19650 series. As I say, 4 parts of them are out now. You'll notice also that a lot of countries are starting to develop their own national annex, okay, which are clarifications to the standards in terms of how ISO 19650 is to be implemented within that country or region. And there's also quite a lot of guidance being published around the world in different countries. We've got CEN, which is the European standards body, developing a lot of standards guidance for ISO 19650 as well. So just to finish off in terms of, appreciate we've covered a lot of information very quickly, but if we do want to remove those wasteful activities and increase the predictability of cost and time on projects, then we need to change the way in which we manage information. If we want to adopt BIM and all the amazing enabling technologies and new ways of working, then we need to change the way in which we manage information. If we want to ensure that delivery teams can produce accurate, complete and unambiguous information, we need to change the way in which we manage information. All right? If we really want to make sure that the right people get the right information at the right time, yeah, we need to change the way in which we manage information. And this is how we do it. All right? This is information management according to ISO 19650. Thank you.
We have a few questions here. I'll start with one which is around the what approach should organizations be taking to adopt these standards?
I guess the short answer is to forget about the standards. Okay, so what we see is a lot of organizations will get transfixed on ISO 19650 and the standard. What we actually recommend is that there will be a few people within the organization responsible for the development of that organization's business processes. You know, how does that organization manage information? What those individuals need to be, they need to be familiar with the standards, because their job is to align that organization's business processes to the ISO 19650 series. All right, but at that point they become that organization's business processes. It's how they manage information. Nobody really needs to know or cares, for that matter, that their business processes are indeed aligned with the latest industry standards and best practice. Okay, so very much make sure that focusing on your own business processes and alignment with 19650 and indeed all the other sort of industry standards and best practice out there.
Okay, another question we have here is regarding information management. Could you give your opinion on COBE and the industry direction?
COBE?
Yeah.
So a bit of context before I give my answer. So in the UK, it was clear that we needed a way of exchanging information that was consistent. As a lot of the public sector clients, they were getting all this data, which is fantastic, but it was all structured in a completely different ways. So the UK government decided, right, we need a standardized way of structuring information that wasn't dependent on the tool that produced it. That suppliers can hand over, and then clients can then suck that data out and into their asset management systems or business systems. So they could either sit down and develop something from scratch, but instead they looked over some of the work that was going on in the US in the Army Corps of Engineers and adopted quite a mature schema called Construction Operation Buildings Information Exchange, or COBE. And so they BS 1192 Part 4. The problem then is that what happened is there was probably each country did something very similar. So there was half a dozen different versions of COBE. One of the projects that I worked on who specified COBE didn't resolve the problem because they still got the US version of COBE, they got the UK version of COBE and other little flavors of COBE. So it didn't really solve the problem. So in the answer to the question, I think COBE is fantastic. I think now there's an informal agreement that is COBE is for how the US structure their data. In the UK, it's known as BS 1192 Part 4. If ISO 19650 Part 4 is published, I suspect what will happen is that it will set out the framework, and then each country will have a national annex setting out that schema. So in the UK, we will put BS 1192 Part 4 as the national annex to ISO 19650 Part 4, and I suspect the US will do something similar with the COBE schema.
Okay, and then we have another question here, final question, which is, could you please elaborate on the BSI kite mark certification?
So basically, because this is a business process, for me, generally this sits within your quality management system and therefore comes under ISO 9001. However, a lot of organizations wanted to differentiate themselves because they've invested a lot of time and a lot of effort in terms of aligning with ISO 19650. And to be able to do that, they wanted the BSI and others came up with certification schemes that they would go in and certify an organization's business processes in terms of its alignment with ISO 19650. We've got the likes of the RTA in Dubai, who are one of the first organizations in the world, not just the Middle East, to be certified both for delivery and operation of assets in terms of ISO 19650. So it just enables organizations to differentiate themselves and to have some external verification of the work that they're doing.